The storm was loud, shaking the windows of Jacob's small farmhouse. The rain fell hard, tapping like small fists on the old wooden roof. Lightning lit the dark sky, followed by the heavy growl of thunder. Jacob was alone, sitting in his chair. Near the fire, holding a cup of hot tea, he had lived on the edge of the forest for years, far from any city. No one ever visited this deep in the countryside, especially not at midnight. Then it happened. A knock. At first, he thought it was the wind or maybe a tree branch. But it came again soft, weak, but real. Jacob stood up slowly, confused and alert. He took his old shotgun from above the fireplace and walked to the door. Another knock, this time faster. Desperate, Jacob opened the door. There she was. An alien woman stood in the pouring rain, her body covered in mud and bruises. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, but not with anger, only fear. She held two small children tightly, both trembling. Their tiny feet bare and wet, her clothes were torn and too thin for the cold night. Her breathing was heavy, and her legs looked like they could collapse at any moment. She didn't speak, not at first. She just handed Jacob a piece of wet paper. He unfolded it carefully, his hands shaking. A little, the note had only a few words, written in broken English. "Please help. No home, children cold. We beg." Jacob looked at her face again. He saw her pain, her silence, and something else, shame. He slowly lowered his shotgun and stepped aside. "Come in," he said softly. The alien woman walked inside, holding the children close to her chest. They were small girls, maybe 4 or 5 years old. With the same glowing eyes, Jacob quickly closed the door and locked it. The wind howled behind them, as if angry he had let strangers in. He brought them near the fire. The woman sat on the floor, placing the girls close to the flames. They huddled together, still shivering. Jacob gave them dry towels and old blankets. He didn't ask questions yet. The girls fell asleep first, their heads on their mother's lap. Jacob made hot soup and offered it to her. She took it slowly, nodding in thanks. Still too afraid to speak, her hands shook as she lifted the spoon, but she never spilled a drop. She had learned to be careful, Jacob thought. Maybe too careful. "What's your name?" Jacob asked. She looked at him but didn't answer. Instead, she touched her chest with her hand and said, "No name." Or maybe that's all she remembered. Or maybe that's all she was allowed to keep. Jacob nodded. All right, no name. He didn't want to push her, not yet. She had come from something terrible, that much was clear. Outside, the storm grew worse. Inside, the fire warmed their wet bodies. The girls started to breathe calmly in their sleep. The woman looked at Jacob for a long time, as if unsure why he was helping. Finally, she whispered in a soft voice, "You. Not afraid?" Jacob raised his eyebrows. "Of you?" She nodded. He smiled. "No, not of you." She looked down quickly, as if her eyes were not allowed to meet his. Jacob didn't understand her story, but he understood the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had been thrown away, and worse. Someone who had started to believe they deserved it. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "All of you." She didn't say thank you, not with words, but her body relaxed, and for the first time since she entered. She closed her eyes. Jacob sat back down in his chair. The shotgun resting beside him, he knew this night had changed something. This wasn't just a lost traveler. This was someone running from something bigger. He watched the fire as it cracked and popped behind him. A woman with no name and 2 alien children slept on his floor, and he had no idea what storm was really knocking at his door. But he had opened it, and now there was no turning back. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air outside still smelled like wet soil and broken branches. Jacob stood near the window, watching the clouds drift low across the hills. Behind him, the alien woman was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire. Holding one of the sleeping girls, she hadn't made a sound. Not even when he moved around the kitchen. She just watched, eyes calm but distant. Like someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Jacob placed a cup of warm tea in front of her, then stepped back without a word. She looked at the cup, then up at him. And after a long pause, nodded once. She still hadn't told him anything. No story. No name, not even where she came from. But there was something in her silence that spoke more than words ever could. She was waiting to see what kind of man he really was. Would he ask questions like the others? Would he make demands? Trade kindness for something else? He didn't. He just cleaned the mud off the floor, dried their clothes by the fire, and made breakfast. The two girls woke up hungry, but didn't cry. They whispered to each other in a language Jacob didn't understand, but their laughter came out in soft, broken pieces, like they had forgotten how to laugh properly. The woman stayed quiet, but let them eat until their small stomachs were full. She didn't eat much herself, as if she was trained to take the smallest share, even when starving. Jacob brought out an old wooden crate and flipped it over to sit across from her. "You can stay here for as long as you need," he said slowly, making sure every word was clear. The woman looked at him, not blinking, like she was studying his face for cracks or hidden lies. After a long silence, she reached for something under the blanketa, small pouch tied with string. She placed it in his hand and motioned for him to open it. Inside were small crystals, shiny, colorful, strange. Not money, not food, but maybe something valuable on her world. Jacob closed the pouch and gave it back. "I didn't help you for this," he said firmly. "Keep it." Her lips trembled slightly, like she wasn't used to being told she was worth more than a trade. Then, very slowly, she pointed to the two girls and said, "Aro and Lena." Jacob repeated the names, and the girls giggled softly. She touched her chest again, paused, and then said something that sounded like Tavara. Jacob nodded. Tavara. She had finally spoken her name that night, when the girls fell asleep in the same blanket pile. Jacob sat outside on the porch, staring at the stars. He had questions, too many questions. Why had she come here? What had she been running from? Why were her daughters so quiet? And why did she flinch every time a noise came from the woods? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft humming, distant but sharp, like metal slicing through the air. He stood up slowly and looked into the darkness. A small blinking light moved behind the tree line, too low to be a star, too fast to be anything natural. It hovered, paused, then blinked twice and vanished. Jacob stepped back inside, closing the door gently. Tavara opened her eyes immediately, her body tense, alert like a soldier. He looked at her and whispered, "Did someone follow you here?" Her jaw clenched, and she didn't answer. She just reached for her daughters and held them tightly. Jacob stood by the door, heart beating faster. Something was coming. And whatever it wasn't friendly. He had taken them in. Now he had to decide, would he keep them safe or send them away before trouble came knocking again? He looked at the frightened eyes of the little girls, then at Tavara, who hadn't blinked once. The decision had already been made. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. They weren't strangers anymore. They were something else now. Something like family. The next few days passed with a strange quiet, the kind that wrapped around the house like mist. Jacob fixed the barn roof, chopped firewood, and tried to pretend nothing had changed, but deep inside, he knew it had. He had never meant to become part of someone else's secret. But now, every time he saw Tavara holding her children, he felt it, that invisible thread tying them together. The girls were smiling more now, running around the farm with bare feet and muddy hands. They laughed in their own language and sometimes copied Jacob's words, saying them back with sweet, confused accents. Tavara still didn't speak much. But she had started helping with chores, quietly planting vegetables, washing the dishes, hanging clothes out to dry. She didn't need to be asked. She just wanted to belong. Jacob noticed her watching the sky every night, standing outside long after the girls were asleep, her arms folded, eyes scanning the stars like she expected something to fall from them. She didn't seem to admire the stars like most people did. She watched them the way someone watches a door they know will break open. One evening, Jacob followed her outside, his boots crunching the dry dirt. "You expecting someone?" he asked, voice low. She didn't answer right away, just stared at the horizon. Then finally, she whispered, "Yes." Jacob looked up too, though he didn't know what he was looking for. He asked gently, "Who are they, Tavera?" She took a slow breath, then said, "My people, my blood. They hunt us now." The words were simple, but heavy, like stones dropped in water. Jacob tried to understand. Why? Why would your own people hunt you? Tavara's jaw tightened, and her voice dropped. "Because of what my daughters carry. Their blood." She turned to him then, and for the first time, he saw it. Not just fear in her eyes, but guilt, pain, and a quiet rage that had been pushed down too long. "Our caste system. Our laws," she said. "My children were never supposed to exist." Jacob frowned. "Because of their father." She nodded once, slowly. "A soldier. From another house," she said. "They called him lesser. Forbidden." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "They took him. Burned our home, said my bloodline was spoiled." She paused, then looked down at her hands. "I ran. They chased me across stars." Jacob felt something in his chest tighten. She wasn't just some poor refugee. She was someone marked for death by her own people. And her children, just two little girls who liked playing with dirt, were the reason. He looked back at the house where the girls were sleeping, their small bodies curled together like kittens. "They want to take them?" he asked, his voice colder now. Tavara nodded. "They want to purify the line." Jacob didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. He had read enough history books to understand what people meant when they talked about bloodlines and cleansing different worlds. Same hate. Later that night, he went out to the edge of the woods to check the old motion sensor near the fence. It had gone off again. Second time that week, the readings showed movement. But nothing visible had crossed the line. Something or someone was watching. Jacob returned to the house with quiet footsteps. Tavara was still awake, sitting at the table, sharpening one of his kitchen knives with perfect control. She didn't flinch when he walked in. She just looked at him and said softly, "They're close." Jacob locked every door and window that night. He moved the girl's sleeping spot to the back room, away from any windows. He sat near the fire, with the shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the shadows. The wind outside howled like a warning. He had brought them in with kindness, but now the truth had come with claws, and Jacob knew if they came for her, they would find a man standing in their way, not a farmer, not anymore. The next morning, the farm felt too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the usual creak of the old gate. Jacob stepped outside with a rifle slung over his shoulder, boots heavy with mud. Tavara followed him without a word, her eyes scanning the tree line like a hawk hunting something it already hated. The air felt thicker today, like even the clouds were holding their breath. The girls were inside, playing with old wooden spoons, pretending they were swords. They didn't know what was coming, or maybe they did, and just chose not to be afraid anymore. Either way, Jacob had made up his mind they would not run again. This place, his land, his home, was going to be theirs too that afternoon. Tavara helped him reinforce the barn. She didn't ask questions when he started stacking sandbags near the windows or placing tripwire along the outer fences. She just moved like someone who had done this before, fast, quiet, and focused. When Jacob handed her an old hunting knife, She held it like it was part of her hand, and for the first time she looked him in the eye and said, "I will fight." He believed her, but he didn't want her to fight alone. They worked through the day, side by side, no need for many words. He built a hidden shelter in the cellar with blankets and food. Just in case, she set up an alert system using old wires and a blinking light from a broken toaster at one point. She stared at Jacob for a long moment and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" He thought for a moment, then shrugged, "Because you knocked on my door." She smiled, just a little, like someone remembering how, that night, Jacob cooked a real meal, fresh bread, stew, and warm milk for the girls. He watched as Tavara helped Aro wash her hands and braided Lena's tangled hair. They looked like a family, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. After dinner, as the girls lay snoring under old quilts, Tavara walked out onto the porch. Jacob followed, stepping into the moonlight. The sky above was clear, stars, bright and sharp like they were watching too. Tavara's voice came out quiet, but certain. "I used to think humans were filthy." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Thanks," she chuckled softly. "Not anymore." She looked at the porch, then at him. "My people believe males should rule, that they must be strong and cruel. That mercy is weakness." She looked away. "But you're strong in a different way." He didn't know how to respond, so he just said, "Well, I do grow good potatoes." She laughed for real this time. This sounds small but beautiful. Then she stepped closer, her voice a whisper only the moon could hear. "In my world, if a male gives shelter during danger, if he protects, it means something." Jacob looked at her. "What does it mean?" Her cheeks flushed a pale lavender, her eyes glowing faintly. "It means you are now husband by law." Jacob blinked, confused. "Wait, what?" She looked serious. "You didn't?" No, he said, shaking his head. "I thought I was just being decent." She smiled again, eyes soft this time. "That's exactly why it counts." For a long moment, they just stood there, the stars above and silence between them. Then she turned to go back inside, but before she walked away, she looked over her shoulder and said one last thing. "If they come, they won't just be coming for me anymore." Jacob nodded slowly, gripping the porch rail tighter. He understood now. He wasn't just protecting guests, he was defending his family. Even if the whole galaxy came knocking next time, they'd find a human standing between them and what was his, and he wouldn't move. It happened just after midnight, when the wind stopped and the forest held its breath. Jacob was wide awake, sitting by the fire with the rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept in 2 nights, not since the blinking light reappeared in the woods. This time, it didn't vanish, it multiplied. 3 red dots moved through the trees like slow, deliberate eyes. Then they stopped, all at once. Like they knew exactly where to look, Jacob stood and walked to the front window, lifting the curtain just enough to see a long, black ship hovered silently just above the ground. Behind the barn, it wasn't a ship meant to travel. It was one meant to take things fast, without questions, without mercy. He turned away from the window and ran toward the back room. Tavara was already up, crouched low beside the girls, both of whom were silent and holding each other. No screams, no panic, just wide, terrified eyes. Jacob nodded, and Tavara kissed each daughter on the forehead, whispering something in her language. Then she looked at Jacob and said, "They are here for blood." He handed her the backup weapon, a short metal baton with a voltage cell wired in. Tavara took it without a word, gripping it like it belonged to her since birth. Jacob opened the trapdoor to the cellar. "Hide with them," he whispered. She stared at him, her voice low and urgent. "They'll kill you." He met her gaze, steady. "Not before I kill a few of them first." She hesitated, then finally nodded and disappeared into the cellar with the girls. Jacob locked the hatch and rolled a heavy crate over it. Then he stepped outside into the cold night. The wind touched his face like a warning, and the air smelled like metal. And smoke. He saw them 3 figures stepping through the mist. Tall, armored helmets like obsidian, weapons humming with energy. They walked like they had already won, like Jacob was just a chore, not a threat. One of them raised a glowing staff and pointed it at him. "Return the defect and the spawns," it said in a cold female voice. Jacob raised his rifle. "I don't return family," they laughed. Not with humor, but with disgust. One of them stepped forward. Her voice full of hate. She was marked. "Her bloodline must end. That is our law." Jacob's eyes narrowed. Funny. "I thought the law was supposed to protect children, not murder them." Then he pulled the trigger. The first shot hit the staff wielder square in the chest, knocking her back with a flash of sparks. The other 2 moved fast, firing back with beams of blue light that burned across the yard. Jacob rolled behind the tractor, firing again and again. He wasn't a soldier, but this was his land, and no one knew its corners like he did. He ducked into the barn, hit the floor lever, and released a homemade trap chain swung down, slamming one attacker into the wall with a crash. The other charged in, weapon raised high, but she never made it to Jacob. Tavra exploded from the shadows, slamming the baton into the soldier's back. Electricity crackled, and the attacker dropped, twitching. Jacob stared at her, wide-eyed. "You were supposed to hide." She stood tall, breathing hard. "You were supposed to survive." They didn't have time to argue. A 4th figure stepped out of the mist, this one different. Taller, gold-trimmed armor, and eyes that glowed white. She was a commander. And her voice made the ground hum. "You are nothing but a pet male," she spat. "You think mating with our garbage gives you power?" Jacob aimed the rifle again, but the commander struck it aside with lightning speed. Knocking him to the ground, she raised her blade, then everything stopped. The girls screamed from the cellar. And in that split second, Tavara moved like a storm. She threw herself between Jacob and the blade. Catching the weapon in her side, blood spilled, dark and thick, but she didn't fall. She grabbed the blade with both hands and screamed a sound that cracked windows. The commander stumbled back, stunned. Jacob grabbed a loose tool and swung it hard into the back of the alien's helmet. Cracking it wide open, the commander dropped, groaning, and didn't get back up. Silence returned, sharp and deep. Tavara fell to her knees. Shaking but alive, Jacob rushed to her, catching her before she hit the ground. "You're bleeding," he said, panicked. She looked up at him and smiled through the pain. "So are you." He looked down. His arm was sliced open. His shirt soaked red, but neither of them cared. From the cellar, small footsteps raced up the stairs. Aro and Lena burst out, running straight into Jacob's arms. Tavara pulled them close, whispering in their ears, voice trembling but strong. "We are still here," she said. "We are still a family, and for now, that was all that mattered." Jacob didn't remember how he got her inside. The fight had ended. The invaders were down. But his hands were shaking, and blood kept dripping from his elbow. Tavara's wound was worse, deep, clean, still bleeding when he laid her gently. On the kitchen floor, the girls hovered nearby, trying to be brave, holding on to each other as if afraid their mother would fade if they let go for even a second. He ripped open an old first aid kit and tried to clean her wound. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She had known pain before, but this time, someone was trying to take it away, and that made her eyes shine with something fragile. Jacob's hands moved fast but careful, his breath short when he tied the last bandage. He sat back, soaked in sweat and blood, staring at her face. "You scared the hell out of me," he whispered. Tavara blinked slowly, then smiled just a little. "I thought I was supposed to." "Protect you," she said, her voice dry like dust. Jacob laughed quietly. "Even though it hurt to do it, you really think I'd let you take all the credit?" She tried to sit up, but he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was hot with fever, but her eyes were steady. "We need to leave," she said. "No," Jacob replied. "We stay, we fight." Together, Tavara stared at him like she was trying to solve a riddle. He had no weapons left, no armor, no backup, but he had stayed when everyone else in her life had run. He had bled for her daughters, for people who didn't share his blood or even his world. "Why? Do you do this?" she asked quietly. "You are not my kind." Jacob shook his head. "Maybe not by birth." Then he looked toward the two girls hiding behind the table. "But I'm theirs now." Tavara's eyes watered. The first real tears he'd seen. From her, she reached up and touched his cheek. "Fingers gentle and trembling in my people's law," she said, voice nearly a whisper. "When a male gives life, shelter, and blood to a female and her offspring without taking anything, in return he is not just protector." Jacob met her eyes, not blinking. She took a breath and finished. "He becomes husband by the right of binding." He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. No. The way his hand closed around hers, the way he looked at her not with pity, but with belonging was enough. Outside, dawn began to creep across the fields, painting the trees with pale gold. The wrecked bodies of the attackers still lay where they had fallen, motionless in the grass. But inside the house, the kitchen was filled with something new warmth, not just from the fire, but from the way the girls leaned against Jacob's leg, the way Tavara looked at him like he was the answer to every silent prayer she'd never dared to speak aloud. Later that day, while Tavara rested, Jacob took the girls out to the garden. He showed them how to dig new holes for the seeds and told them stories about how he once planted a tree that grew lopsided. The girls giggled and asked if they could have their own trees. One each, he promised them they would, and not just trees, chickens, goats. A swing set if he could find the wood. When they returned, Tavara was waiting at the door. Wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but proud, she reached out her hand, and Jacob took it behind her. Something small hung from the wall, simple. Thread with 3 tiny colored stones tied in a loop. It wasn't gold or a real wedding band, but when Jacob saw it, he understood what it meant. Not protection, not survival, but family. Chosen not by law or blood, but by the moment a stranger opened a door in the middle of a storm and refused to let go. He had never said, "I do," but somehow the stars had heard him anyway. Weeks passed, and the land slowly returned to peace. The scars on Jacob's arm healed, though the skin stayed tight where the blade had cut deep. Tavara's wound had closed too, leaving a pale mark just below her ribs. But some things didn't heal in silence. They healed in laughter, in warm soup shared over fire, in the sound of children running barefoot across the porch with dirty faces and loud, joyful screams. Jacob had rebuilt the barn. Stronger this time. Reinforced with parts from the wrecked alien ship that still sat hidden behind the tree line. He had dragged the bodies out to the edge of the woods and buried them without ceremony. The commander's cracked helmet still sat on a shelf above the fireplace. A reminder and a warning. The girls no longer jumped at loud noises. They no longer whispered in fear when night came. They danced instead, spinning in circles until they fell over, giggling, and shouted words in 2 languages, his and theirs. Sometimes they called him Papa, and it no longer felt like a mistake. Tavara had changed too. She no longer slept with a knife under her pillow. Her eyes didn't scan the sky like they used to, searching for danger. Now they searched for Jacob when he walked out of the room. She began wearing simple, earth-clothes flannel shirts, too big for her. Sleeves rolled up hand helped Jacob run the farm like she'd always belonged here. He taught her how to drive the old tractor, and she taught him a lullaby from her world. They sang it to the girls every night. One night, she added new words to it in English, just for him. Jacob had thought a lot about what she'd said weeks ago about being husband by law. But it was something else now. Deeper than duty or ritual. She didn't stay because he saved her. She stayed because he saw her. Not as an alien, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. And then came the day when another ship appeared in the sky. Not black, not silent, not like the last one. This one landed far beyond the field and sent no soldiers, only one visitor. Stepped out, a tall woman in pale armor with the same glowing eyes as Tavara. She walked slowly to the fence and waited. No weapons, no threats. Tavara stepped out with Jacob. Standing tall beside him, the girls clung to his legs, nervous again, but not afraid. The armored woman spoke gently. "We were told you had died. I should have," Tavara replied. But a man opened his door. The woman looked at Jacob, then at the children. "I was sent to confirm your fate," she said, "and to report if your offspring live." Jacob's grip tightened on his tool belt. Tavara stepped forward. Calm but fierce. "They live." The woman hesitated, then slowly removed a small disc from her belt. She placed it on the ground and stepped back as it dissolved into dust. "No beacon," she said. "No signal. They will not find you again." Then she bowed not low. "But enough. May your bond be blessed," she whispered, and turned back toward the ship. Tavara watched her go without moving. When the ship vanished into the clouds, she finally let out a breath Jacob didn't realize she'd been holding. That night, the stars shined brighter, as if the sky itself had changed. Tavara came to Jacob on the porch. Wearing one of his old jackets and carrying a small box, inside was a thin silver band, shaped from part of the wreckage that tried to tear them apart. She slipped it onto his finger without a word. He didn't need one. He kissed her forehead. And the two girls jumped into their arms, giggling and shouting. The house behind them glowed with warm light. The land no longer felt quiet. It felt alive. They had been strangers once. She had been hunted, broken and lost. He had been alone, with nothing but an empty field and an open door. But now they were something stronger, not because of blood or stars or laws, but because when the world closed its fists around them, they held on to each other instead, and that made them a family the galaxy could never break.